she talking about me? Thank you all for coming, and thanks to the sponsors. Should I sit down? Do you want me to stand up? Can you hear me? Can you hear me okay? So it's an incredible pleasure to be here. I was saying to a few people before we got started here that I grew up teaching, what do they call you here, Jimmy? James, Mr. Louder?
Professor Louder.
Professor Louder. So Professor Louder. We sort of grew up at SciArc together. And I think of SciArc, Kulper, and the AA being sort of sister schools in terms of the importance of the places, the legacies. She's had enough. She's had enough. So it's really, really great to be here. And I just want to thank Natalie and the students in the committee for being super generous since I turned up half an hour ago, touring the building and so on. So it's a huge honor to be here. I hope I don't stink the place up. So I'm going to do the talk. The talk is structured around a sequence of four things. The first, I'm going to read. Yep. Jimmy knows what I'm going to say anyway. I'm going to read 24 things that I like, and then I'm going to show you some images of people and things that have been influential for me. And what am I going to do third? Third, I'm going to, nice shoes, Octavia. Third, I'm going to set some principles into play that sort of travel with me. And fourth, I'm going to show you a cross-section of some work and try to link it to the early thoughts. As I read, I'm going to read not so much but enough to get you grounded. I'm going to show you, just cycling through in the background, I'm going to show you some images of speculative houses, gardens, and landscapes that I've been working on. I don't know a thing in the digital realm, so I open up Photoshop and spent sort of 1 to 3 hours a piece on them. So those will be just cycling. They're essentially sort of drone views of things. And then I'll get, I don't know, that's just fooling around a little bit, trying to work out cut and paste and so on. And then I'll try to show you some work that's, I don't know, of different kind of meaning. So I couldn't work out, I thought I'd just show you some title sheets. That's all I'm going to show you tonight. I couldn't work out which one to pick, so I made 3 to set up the conversation. So here we go. And I'm going to try to sync this up where the 24 I likes coincide with what I say and what you see on the screen. Architectural education should be pithy, contentious, its head on the chopping block, like it or not. 2, I like thinking about Van Gogh's Lone White Iris, Lady Gaga, and nanotechnology, all in the same spatial sweep. 3, there are substantial differences between building, architecture, and spatiality. A simple observation with game-changing consequences, like what's in and what's not. 4, I like thinking about the abandonment of typological obligations in favor of ecological provocations. This approach invites contingent and unpredictable practices rather than confirming what's already known. This kind of thinking breeds as yet unimagined spatial species. 5, using pre-spatial language prompts can trigger inventive programmatic thinking. Imagine germinal objects, verdant programs, fallow surfaces, knotted thresholds, all subject to change at the flip of a phase shift, just like that. 6, I like thinking about Wallace Stevens' 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird as templates or a DNA for developing critical skill sets capable of gathering heterogeneous characters in search of a strangely familiar and yet just out of reach whole. 7, probing questions should infectiously populate the educational terrain of architecture. For example, When is the time of rendering? Could architecture be schizophrenic, delusional, and paranoid simultaneously? Might a plan be made here and the section over there, both suddenly morphing into a transitory landscape or something like that? 8, I like thinking about the contemporary architect being many architects, a hybrid species, agile and skilled at occupying contested edges and dusty perimeters, yet capable of turning on a dime. 9, 21st century architects might speculate on split temporalities and split geographies. Imagine architectural propositions that scan data surfaces of now, then, and sometimes sites, morphing at warp speeds while hijacking our expectations and suddenly disappearing, just about like that. 10, I like thinking about promiscuous conceptions of architecture in the 21st century. For example, spatial ventriloquism, architecture that behaves like a fast change artist, red, 3 houses in one. 11, unlike the language of architecture, the language of representation positions materiality as conceptual, temporality as malleable, and gravity as negotiable, like alchemy, but only just a bit like that. I like thinking about developing digital software. If anyone can do this, I'll pay you my salary for the rest of my life. Digital software that could simultaneously embroider metaphorical impulses, narrative twists, statistical mutants, and the consequences of a psychological whim spatially without batting an eye. Anybody up for that? Please see me after the talk. 13. Arguably, architecture education needs to be grounded. Equally, it needs to be a high risk taker, a tightrope walker, a contemporary hybrid of Harry Houdini and Evel Knievel. I like thinking about this too. 14. I like thinking about the daytime facade of a Home Depot reconfiguring itself to become a nocturnal agricultural surface, changing land values as it morphs from one form to another. Or what about duplicating a domestic interior, sending the clone into the neighborhood at night to commingle with other domestic environments? Or I like thinking about suburban backyards that regenerate themselves, becoming a collection of fish markets by dawn and a bioluminescent electromagnetic field by night. 15, analogous thinking. This looks like that, this behaves like that, can increase your formal and material imagination and skill sets instantly 100-fold in a snap of the fingers, just like that. 16, I like thinking about the use of generative history and progressive theory with big, lush, and fidgety velvet cushioned chairs at the table of 21st century architectural education. 17, Marcel Duchamp's 3 standard stoppages might be a metric for the construction of architectural education, transforming accepted norms, twisting as they might, approximately like that. 18, I like thinking about an architectural proposition structured like paired cuckoo clocks wearing hip waders. The architectural surfaces might be tattooed like an embroidered and sequined pair of Western boots, and the landscape for the architecture might be organized like the Chinese game of Go, crossed with calligraphic utterances. Analogs work like that. 19, once an inviolate part of the socially and subjectively constructed figure of the architect, the architectural drawing is an increasingly complex affair, a tricky business to say the least. I like thinking about that, I guess. 20, I like thinking about an educational model where it matters less what you work on, but more on how intensely you work on it. 21, a new city proposition for China might require utilizing different design methods in relationship to hybridizing biomorphic interests and geographic data splicing. Diverse and highly varied design methods might allow us to work with different circumstances, just like that. 22, I like thinking about architecture that might materialize the space of the building's construction rather than the building. Or what about motivating erasure as an architectural activity? Is it possible to think about things like that? 23, the education of 21st century architects should not aim to prove the profession. Rather, I like thinking about significant points of contact and critical points of difference between professional training and disciplinary positioning. 24, I like thinking about what the 21st century architect might think about. 24, educational I likes. I like thinking about that. I'm lucky to have studied, I'm not going to read everything, just bear with me, there are a handful of paragraphs here. I'm lucky to have studied at Columbia with the likes of Mary McLeod, Ken Frampton, Bob Stern, which we have 3 illustrious members of his cohort, Loretta Venturi, Tim Wood, Mario Salvadori, and many others. I've been extremely fortunate to have taught at Penn, SciArc, and Michigan for long periods of time. High-quality individuals, including faculty, staff, and students. Time spent in and around Cambridge in the UK and the Bartlett, where I'm the visiting Sir Bannister Fletcher professor this year, is not inconsequential. Working with Peter Eisenman, Bob Stern, and Denise Scott Brown, and Bob Venturi also stoked the fires. Much of my thinking is the work of an amateur, hinged to no forms of expertise or real knowledge, but motivated by a willingness to probe relationships amongst things, conceptual frameworks and phenomenon, constructing a discipline. Likely teed up as a young character out of Columbia when I started road bike racing, with little to no understanding about how to do something like that, is the discipline by which I now practice. These experiences, coupled with observing and occasionally participating with my father, who was a fine cabinet maker, opened my eyes. In the early days, I followed the lead of others, trying to find my way in the deep horizons of education, the profession, and the discipline. Eventually, I started thinking around things, and I hope up the sleeve of things, testing the roles of mischief while trying to keep my eyes on the ball. Venturi was of real import. He was a friend. Sorry, I'm going to stop here. You can scan this. Venturi was of real import. He was a friend and mentor. I lived with he and Denise for 2 months when I moved to Philadelphia to work in the office. Things that are both and multiple, things to do with ambiguity, etc., got locked onto my radar. I began to think about reframing what it means to practice, how one might need to live multiple or parallel lives. Many amateurs composited into a character, always on the hunt for transformation. I've tried to care about cultural and disciplinary responsibility, differences between the discipline and the profession, how to frame things outside program or context discussions, and how to construct something like a practice or many practices. There's real value in all of the experiences I've had and the people that I've been incredibly fortunate to be around. I've tried to develop a dexterity to value many perspectives. The work, and understanding the roles that things can play, real and specific, workable, discursive, rhetorical, structural, sacrificial, and so on, matter to me. In preparation for this eve, I was thinking about things or characters that might animate an education, the discipline, and perhaps my practices as a teacher and architect. For example, grounding things in the history of ideas, positioning the context of architectural education, the discipline and practices as critical constructions, identifying the players and roles of the constructed parts of both. For example, What are pedagogical models, curricular options, studio culture, the use of language, history, theory, other, the review, types of practice, shelf lives of education, and so on. Developing a vocabulary of operative terms in architecture, articulating the difference between the language of representation and the language of architecture, exposing, positioning, and framing representation techniques and design methods for working, acknowledging sliding languages between disciplines, the import of relational thinking and structuring. And that's all I will read, so thanks for your patience. I'm now just going to work through a handful of influences. You've had a chance to look at some people, things, phenomenon here. I've got about 10 of these, of each one of these sort of plates. These are people in the drawing or representation realm who have been important to me. This is a roadmap for the ways in which I try to conduct my life and practice. Marcel Duchamp opened for me who can make art and what qualifies as art through both his large glass and certainly fountain. Man Ray was also important in his the work that he did with other Dadas. Here, photographing the large glass with a bunch of dust on it, dust breeding. Or Joseph Beuys, an important artist in my realm. Here, with a coyote, locked in a gallery with a coyote for a handful of days. Or the American artist who hangs out with Bjork, Matthew Barney, and his interest in surrealism, autobiographical conditions, and physical training of athletes. Or the photographer Richard Barnes, who essentially documents things, but documents them in ways that render or reframe a world. Or Ai Weiwei, the Chinese dissident artist, who innumerably has political and social activist tendencies in his work. Or Richard Mizrak, the great California photographer in his Desert Cantos series. Or something like the Boneyard at the Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona, where 5,000 military aircraft occupy the ground. An interesting erasure got developed here, for example. Or Abe Morell, who's a photographer who lives in Boston. Or Ron Heron, Archigram, Walking City. Brodsky and Utkin, the great Russian architects, their project for a doll's house. The great Hieronymus Bosch, the earliest surrealist in my opinion. The Garden of Earthly Delights. Leonardo da Vinci, of course, in his advent of the construction, developing instruments that might work on certain kinds of things. Boulet's Cenotaph for Newton. Piranesi's Carcieri drawings, in which the openness of the drawing is in direct opposition or conflict with the suppression and the containment of the prison drawings themselves. Or Diego Velázquez's Las Meninas, in which the subject is rendered transformative or mutable. We're not sure whether we're the artist, whether we're being painted, whether we're in the mirrors, whether we're standing outside of the scene. So the subject construction is important here. Or the great surrealist painter René Magritte in The Human Condition, beginning to talk about what's real and what's artificial. And of course, probably the most famous building for me in the repertoire would be Borromini's San Carlo alle Quattro Fontane, the great Baroque church in Rome. This is what my work table looks like. This is what my other work table looks like. These are key things that I care about, that travel with me. Don't need to go through them. You can put your eyes on them. They're not of descending import. They're all important to me in some way or ways. We don't have time to move through them, but it looks like there might be a recording of this if you're interested, or contact me and I'm happy to share them with you. I care enormously about design methods, that is the ways in which we work, not representation techniques, design methods. It's probably the most under-taught aspect of architectural education, in my opinion. I wouldn't go to a surgeon probably and ask them to work on my heart, and they say, well, methodologically, I don't have a clue how to do that. So these are very important to me. I've developed. Hello, Michael Young.
How you doing, brother?
Good. How are you, man?
Good to see you.
Yeah, you as well. So Michael Young's just come. Where you come from? Dallas.
Dallas.
Yeah, good for you. Yeah, good to see you. These are a few drawing types that I've worked on. When I work on drawings or representations, they're tailored for the phase of work that I'm working on. They're task specific. Sometimes I use conventions, sometimes I try to invent things. These are 13 drawing thoughts, which also travel with me. I won't go through them in detail. We'd be here quite a long time tonight, but you can, again, put your eyes on a handful of them. They matter to me quite a lot. These are different patterns in my work. When I look at the work over some 20 plus years now, there are a number of things that turn up in the work fairly consistently, no matter how much I try to diversify the interest, diversify the approaches, make pieces of work different from the next. There's stuff that I always do. There are many kinds of ways in which I try to develop a practice, although I work almost never. I probably worked 6 months in the last 12 years. One of them are conceptual catalysts. I've identified 7 key categories that I think are contemporary in nature. And I basically make language folds to produce projects. So, maybe again, you can look at these out of focus architecture. Spatial ventriloquism, architecture that makes, erases, and remakes itself. The categories, for me, are important. A whole set of discussions around materiality, fabrication, and production, things to do with atmospheres, ambient, structure, character, things to do with change, flux, temporal fluctuations. Multiple temporalities interest me a lot. So these are finished projects, really. Time-lapse architecture, what might that be? Architecture that scans a site and diversifies its commitment to distant geographies rhythmically. Things to do with duration, that is how long things are in play, how strong, weak, how they fluctuate according to temporal frameworks. Conceptual things, growing a building, 3 houses in one, architecture that produces false shadows and so on in the architectural drawing. So these are word games that I play with myself. There are many of these, just as a way to train my imagination to imagine what's possible conceptually. I'll show you some work. It probably gets increasingly less interesting now, if it was at all interesting to begin with. So I've made 750 landscape drawings. I was just trying to sort out, we were taking students out to the American Southwest and for a week, and at SciArc, I didn't have a clue what the landscape was about or how we might talk about it. So I just started making one-a-day drawings, and they're somewhere between 45 minutes and maybe an hour and a half a pop. I haven't made any for 12 years. I don't make any judgments about them. Sometimes there are thematics that I'm working on, like the upper left-hand one, I was thinking about Pompeii, archaeologies. I was thinking about red ponds over here, and I had some pigment on the work table and made some stuff. So I just make them. I was thinking about monochromatic landscapes and so on. Now I'm going to show you, Michael, he'll close his eyes or he'll take a snooze now for a while. I'm going to just show you some work that I made when I left Denise and Bob's office and I moved to LA, started teaching at SciArc. I thought I was going to be a real architect. And I got some commissions. I got a commission for a little guest house, and I was invited to an international competition to do a house based on a 15th century text. So I did that. And then I had another real commission for a little house in the desert, so 1,600 square feet, and they were all at the same time. And I thought I had some skills, and I knew I didn't have much of a brain or an intellect, but I thought maybe I could do something. It proved not to be the case. So none of these got built. I didn't think they were very interesting. And I really had a really difficult time, sort of psychologically, emotionally. I just started to teach at SciArc, and I was around sort of giants to me at the time. Eric Moss, Tom Main, Neil Denari, Marianne Ray, Tom Burrish, all kinds of people, Mike Rotundi. And I sort of beat myself up pretty seriously for a period of time, and then said, "This is ridiculous. You don't have any other skills. If you have any skills as an architect, you don't have any skills at all for anything else." So I started then to think about the architectural drawing a little bit as a way to maybe see things a little bit differently. So I made a series of drawings that I called aspectival drawings, and they challenge perspective. They're non-synthetic, uncoordinated fragments, critical fragments of architecture. So this is a second desert house. And at the same time, Amy was doing a PhD, doing an MPhil and PhD at Cambridge in England, and we lived in a house that was about a third the width of this room. And I just made a room basically at the same time as those other houses. I was moving back and forth between Penn, SciArc, and Cambridge, England. So I just made a little house, a room actually, with a double aquarium and leather floor, and it's got all kind of stuff to do with sort of hell in the basement. There's a rubber-lined basement and heaven above, and then there's a sort of working class street just outside the window here, and then a cemetery the other way, so sort of cross axes of heaven and hell, and cemeteries and sort of blue collar neighborhoods and so on. Really quick, very quick piece of work. And then a little bit later on, I got onto an open competition for an island that's not far from here, David's Island. And these are probably the most important marks of my life, just whatever little stuff that I do. Whereas they're called strategic plotting. You're trying to plot conceptual things, phenomenon, and objects over and through time. So this is 1996, so I told you already I don't have any digital skills, so I couldn't have done it if the digital realm was in play. But I was interested in things that basically shifted over and through time. And I tried to invent programmatic logics that were in contact with the kind of thinking I was doing. I was trying to work on things like remoteness, panoramic and panoptic vision, nocturnal transgressions, cyclical things, mythical folklore, things to do with the sea, and so on. And I developed programmatic things like labyrinths of emptiness, landings for mythical sea travelers, polished metamorphic rock gardens, multiplied officers' headquarters, and so on. So I used the architectural drawing to start to deal with content, but also to hold, for me, with my little brain, just to hold a number of things in place simultaneously, using language, notations, diagrams, figuration, found stuff, and so on. A bit later, I took on another competition for a museum, and I developed another series of drawings. This is a thematic drawing where I'm just trying to visualize the content for the work. So what the work's about, scientific, historic, and aesthetic understandings of collections, the problem of the gaze and the glance, collections as a cultural construction, the Greek muses as an etymological ground for the contemporary museum, and so on. And I then developed a series of drawings that I called cryptic drawings. They're basically genetic. They're like DNA. They're not formal or figural, but they have intelligences for me that aspire to formal and material makeup. Then a series of proto-formal, that is prior to form drawings. This is for there's an alabaster surface in the project where there are 9 drawing instruments that etch away at the alabaster, and they're based on the 9 Greek muses and their characteristics and so on. And then things that get increasingly architectural, but they're not quite there yet. Those are proto-formal drawings, a sectional drawing. Some things have material properties in this drawing. Some things have geometric logics. Other things are hunches, wanderings, remnant thinking, and so on. So I'm happy to leave lots of things in play, things that I'm more certain about and committed to, other things that I don't know that might be in play, but I don't have a sense of that. And then essentially a kind of first sketch for the museum, just a drone view. And got interested in this project about how we might erase things that are familiar to us in domestic realms to produce a new house. So things like thresholds and programs and equipment and furniture and so on. So I made a series of relational drawings where I was just trying to work on erasure and recoding the erase marks. And they're not plans or sections or anything like that. They're not architectural. They're just relational drawings that work on a very bracketed set of questions. In the early 2000s, my work was super slow. I was working hard at it when I worked, but it took forever. So I decided to make a house project that I called Fast Twitch, that basically tried to summon fast twitch design muscles. And I used analogic thinking, that is, this is like that, this behaves like that, and so on, as a way to get the house in play. So the house is like an English tea setting. There are landscape milling machines that mill garden surfaces like you're seeing it like a CNC milling machine. There are all kinds of likenesses to try to get booted up really, really quickly to make a house proposal. Just pretty conventional drawings. There's a composite drawing that's half elevation, half section with some notational things and some displaced fragments. And then again, a very preliminary rendition of the house. I would say is the equivalent of a quick sketch model. So there are a series of milled garden surfaces. There are chromed shadows that belong to the 3 big architectural objects. The architectural objects, you eat in one, you sleep in one, and you live in one. The trouble with the one that you live in is it's filled with logs, and you can't get inside of it. And it's calibrated, it's made of steel. That's that one. And the steel is calibrated to dematerialize over 100 years, leaving a pile of logs essentially on the site. There's a labyrinth that you can't get into, but there's a red object that makes noise. There's a pink dust garden along which the sleeping vessel moves when people aren't there. They're milled in real cacti. There's a chromed billiard ball, and so on. So I'm telling you what the things are. This is a sleeping realm. There's cuckoo clock-like objects that you sleep in. And so on. So I'm not telling you anything in this one about the content. I'm basically just describing what things are. There are things to do with copyright issues and mass production, logo developments, and so on. And here you can see the chromed shadows. And they're real shadows, of course, from the desert. This is looking down the face of the living space, the space that's filled with logs. And you live in 2 baskets, and there's a miniature version of the house built as a part of the living space. I was invited to the Prague Biennale to deal with architecture as a transient phenomenon, and I developed what I called a metaspheric zoo, which is a cross between metaphors and atmosphere. And it's based on, if it got developed, which it never did, it's based on animal behaviors species interactions, breeding, territorializations, and so on, to try to produce an alternative landscape and architecture based on bestial characteristics, essentially. So these are biopsies of a drawing that was it's about 15 feet long, and it was made of materials and so on, and a strategic thematic plot, essentially. 10 years ago, I got some cash from the school, Monica Ponce de Leon. We had these brilliant things called Research Through Making. You get $20,000 to do something. So I spent $4,000 because I was totally unorganized and we're trying to do 23 things and so on. Anyway, I was interested in how we might breed landscape types, the picturesque garden, formal gardens, knot gardens, and so on, landscape elements, dikes, revetments, berms, fences, with landscape biologies, which have to do with temporal constructions. So I was interested in breeding those three aspects of landscape and trying to produce a more temporally sensitive and choreographed and unchoreographed architecture. And now I say when I show this, there are things like fabric predators. There are a series of analogous drawings to try to look at how things behave over and through time. There are graphic, notational, and real landscape conditions. There are zipper blooms. These are all early studies for things. This got about 12% of the where it should have gotten. And $16,000 went back into the kitty. So these are some of the final images. There are things like the zipper blooms, and there are test tube berms, and that cultivate miniature ecologies, and then the fabric predators distribute those in the notational landscapes and so forth. There are a couple of examples of when I work, there are just lots of kinds of work. These are really, really quick. So I took a trip to Vancouver, BC, and saw some killer whales and thought it might be nice to make some architectural sections based on killer whales. So I made a bunch of these, just horsing around really. And then Jimmy and Michael, Jimmy for sure knows Coy Howard. We made a series of, we made 5 rooftop houses before we moved to Ann Arbor. And this is a plan, that's a plan for one of them. Got a bunch of things around. So I'm interested in building envelopes, surfaces, skins. So I've got 6, this is called vertical surfaces. I've got 6 of those in play. These are a couple of them. I'm working on a floor triptych, so I'm really interested in, I know I share this with Professor Young as well, interested in diptychs and triptychs, paintings, historically grounded things. And I'm trying to work on a floor triptych which discusses ceilings and takes perspectival constructions out of play. So this is just cut paper pieces from a floor triptych that I'm working on. And then Nat, my good friend and collaborator, sometimes we do a little bit together, not much, but we were fortunate to win Pamphlet Architecture 34. And we were interested in contingent and indeterminate architectures, that is architectures that don't predict how we participate but open sort of possibilities. So I made a series of drawings. This one has to do with a spatial setup that might allow contingent architecture to be practiced. This is also part of that series of drawings. And then we made a series of drawings of which this became an important one for to occupy. Nat's made these. If you don't know Nat's work, it's really incredible. We're fortunate to have an exhibition at the Bartlett right now And this is the only collective piece of work really, but he's made these drawing instruments that they put quite a lot at risk, from the picture plane to narrative constructions to indeterminate conditions and so on. So we made two instruments, one housed my drawing, one housed his drawings, and we basically staged a conversation between them as a specific part of the work for pamphlet architecture. So these are images from, these are time-lapse images here from the paint being thrown sort of medieval catapult style from my world to his world. There are a series of things, a dome that has narrative constructions in it, an object that interrupts the paint flow, the drawings themselves, and so on. So we continue to have conversations and, about lots of things with these two characters. I'd like to have more conversations, but they're more important than I am, so they don't talk to me. So, now I haven't seen Jimmy in a long time. So, more recent work then. I started thinking about architects not really dealing with the sky, and I made three analogic drawings for what I call aerial diptych follies, and the follies do sort of clandestine work to do a surveillance, but they also are meant to be sort of spectacular aerial things that are deceitful in terms of what they're actually doing. So I made quickly the follies are sort of the central piece, and then I was able to get a little bit of money from the school to try to get under the digital hood, to try to work out within digital protocols if there might be opportunities that we might work on. So how an image becomes modeled, how you might model light sources through shadowing, how you might take flat things and imagine deep space within them. So this is really, really recent work in early days. So they sort of care about this kind of diagram, and then we're working on some things with a former student, Gary Chung, who's graciously come tonight to waste his time. There's a guy called Oliver Popovich, who Gary knows. And so everything's modeled in this. Everything's modeled. And we're trying to just work out just a series of conversations about, in the operations of digital management, what might be possible as kind of content or meaning construction. So this is the second one.
Sorry, so these are photographs?
This is a physical construction that I made. They're about that big, and then we did a little bit of Photoshop, and this is all digitally modeled. Everything's modeled. The image stuff's modeled. Everything's modeled. So we're just trying to, just a little bit. There's not very much time. We haven't had very much time to work on it, Oliver. But I think there's some open terrain here. I think there's some stuff to be worked on. And then the third one is by some the most developed. So this is the image that I made. This is a bit what the workspace looks like. This is an elevation of the digital model that comes from it. And then there are a series of things which come out of trying to work with the image and digital modeling. So everything's modeled. And again, we're just so if we go back, this sort of city realm. that left-hand patterned paper bit that I put into the original drawing, the city realm was on the other side of that. Don't ask me any questions about this stuff. We're just got the feet in the water. Yeah. So anyway, it's quite a lot of fun. Again, modeling things which are normally, they're not modeled at all. In digital, you're just doing the operations. We're trying to model operations and things and relationships between things. Quite a lot of fun. Quite a lot of fun, but not very much time in it yet, sadly. But I think it's sort of getting somewhere. I feel there's some traction. So that's that. And then, so I got invited, I don't know, 2.5 years ago or something to design a bird motel. And there were 29 architects from other places in the world, and everybody got a foam blank, like an iconic house. And I said, I'm not doing that. So we tried to then just work on another birdhouse, a bird motel, which, so I have an idea about designing 13 bird motels, but through which I essentially try to frame my work and my teaching. And this was the first one. So it's interested. These are just inspirational images that got built to try to get our legs underneath us for what we're going to try to do. And all three of them to date are physical. They're meant to be physical things. There's a rhetorical one eventually. There's a discursive one. There's one that only produces alternative shadows to a former one. Blah blah blah. But the bird motel, essentially, all of them try to invert human, non-human relationships. And they do that in different ways. So this one, it's a physical thing. Just describe the parts. We doing okay for time? Is it like Friday? Half okay? It's okay. You bored stiff? Almost finished. So there's a bird landing strip. There's a garden. There's a bird landing strip where they arrive at the motel. There's what's called a deep taxonomical bird. That's the yellow thing underneath. There are 3 clouds. And in the big cloud, there's a windsock room, special room for people like Michael Young and Jimmy Lauder. That's also where the sign is called the Flights of Fancy Bird Motel. There are 3 hedges, and one of the hedges also stores bird perches. There's a watering trough. There's a bird rug. There are surveillance objects, and there are 5. There's a diving board, and there are 5 bird perches. And there's a bunch of content that goes with this, but those are the elements that comprise this. It was a fun thing to make. Probably 90% of the ideas had to be dumped because couldn't figure out. It's a really short time frame. Couldn't figure out how to build them. So, but it's there are quite a few 3D printed pieces. There are some milled pieces, and then it's painted. So this bird is about the size of a dove, and the first one we made, it's 3D printed at really high level, and the wings we miscalibrated the wings. The wings are the wings are thinner than paper. We had to ship it to Italy. So another $300 out of the pocket. We quadrupled the wings. Just learning stuff. Quadrupled the thickness of the wings so that the thing, you could put it in a box and ship it. Then there's a second version of the floating bird motel, and sadly we basically cobbled together the landing strip from the first one. And we used that as a kind of carcass or chassis for the second one. I wouldn't have done that. We'd had no time, no money, needed to get underway. So it's not what it should be, but it's got a little bit of traction. So this one uses programmatic features primarily to reroute human, non-human relations. So there are things like, there's a stuffed technology garden, which is based on trophy rooms. But in this case, there are rockets, planes, satellites that are clad in floral and berry material, so the birds can enjoy the stuffed technology garden. There's a Dymaxion, there's a Bucky Fuller Dymaxion rug, there's a fireplace, there's a fountain, there are bird perches and so on. And there are several versions of this floating bird motel. So there are also dancing bird alphabet topiary figures, these things. And they inscribe on a dome. So this is the, let's see. I forget the gestures, Perry. Go here. So in the hall, there are windsock rooms and there's a bird ballroom. And at the top of the bird ballroom, there's a dome. And the dome is inscribed continuously by these dancing bird alphabet topiary pieces that track themselves. And then there's a talisman. This is the bird table. And there's a micro weather system, and for the birds, there's a sail. Where's the sail? There's the sail, and it's an homage to Wallace Stevens' 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. Blah blah blah. So the objects, depending on what environment they're in, they change their surface characteristics. And the surface characteristics are developed through drawings which I've made in other contexts, the Photoshop bits. Blah blah blah. So it's quite fun. There are different styles. There are singles and there are doubles and there are 1.5 birds that make these up, and they occur in domes of churches, over runways of important airports, in taxidermy workspaces, and so on. So they're a bit promiscuous, is this set of things. There are 3.5 of them. So another character that Gary also knows, a guy called Carl Heckman. We're working, this is like a 2-hour exercise this would be maybe the 4th one, the bird motel. This is called Tugboat, and this is a kind of working class bird motel, and eventually it's going to have a panoramic sort of entertainment center for the workers that floats as a kind of halo around this object and so on. I should have mentioned, one of the things I like a lot in the bird ballroom, in the last one, is there's dioramic wallpaper which scans distant landscapes and projects those as scenic views relative to the interior bird ballroom. So just horsing around, really, just fun stuff. So this is literally a 2-hour thing. And just a couple of last things. So a friend and colleague, Jeff Halstead at Michigan, we were talking, and he's interested in the Photoshop things that I made. And he saw some of them, and he said, "Let's have a go at translating those digitally." I said, "All right, sounds good." So I'll just show you a few images. So this is the image that I made, and then this is the first take on that image. And so this is the house landscape garden problem, and in this one now, I'm interested in trying to bring a second house landscape and garden into the topography of the first one, so they're starting to develop that a little bit. And these are early days. They're they're primarily formal, so they're a touch problematic maybe in that regard. But I think there's plenty of room in these. This is another one of my sort of drone views of the landscape house garden problem. And this is the first pass sort of digitally modeling that one. And obviously just a rendering. And then this is the drawing that I made, and then this is these are translations of that particular version 83, and digitally modeled. And just one last piece of work. The most recent floating bird motel. Carl Heckman worked on this. Just finished thesis. Again, there's an interest in inverting human, non-human relationships. There are things to do with how birds optically perceive things. It's sort of a straightforward program. There's a log. This elevation on the right, so there's a log that has various technologies and various degrees of finish, refinement, and wildness. On top of that, there's a micro weather system. It's really underdeveloped. The middle piece is a shrine float piece, and then on the right-hand side essentially is the housing for the bird motel, and you see elevations of the housing. There's an honorific bird, which there's an interior, this shrine space that exists in the middle vertical piece. It's topped out with the bird with the helmet on the top. There's a theater, which is these sort of three bits on the nose of it, and there are other things, but just trying to work on this. Relatively quickly. The log is a bit interesting. There's a Loget's primitive hut that belongs to it out here on the sort of gantry piece. Yeah, there are other things. And so we're the non-human human relationships, a bird motel and a lineage of bird motels. The log I think is interesting. The other parts they're more known. They're things that I might normally do. But the log, I think there's some room in the log and what it entails. And there are micro worlds now being inscribed in the log that don't have anything to do with the birds really, but have to do with sort of emergent characteristics. It's a first pass at the weather system garden, the micro. And this is an image of, you see the, we're not talking about the ideas thoroughly. Did you see Loget's hut, sort of skinny a bit, but some things happening with that. Log breeding birds and having tattoo-like things and different technologies involved in it and so on. Yeah, just views of straightforward views of the object. So we're just writing a piece for a new AD to do with the 60s and 70s avant-garde. We're going to take this up. There'll be a couple of images of this. We'll work on it a fair bit between now and the time the writing's due. And then just lastly, to return to the work of the amateur, the work of Shauna and Robert Park Harrison, the Brothers Architect. It's a beautiful series. Do you know it? I mean, it's a phenomenal. So they get up to no good as amateurs, and they're just trying to work out how to develop a way to practice their trades. So that's it. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for lasting. Again, it's super humbling to be here amongst the giants that both belong to the place now, but have also populated this place. This is a special place. As I said, the AA, SciArc, and this place, right here. So thank you all very much for the invitation and for listening. Anybody have any questions? Yeah, please.
Can I ask you about the black and white plans?
The black and white?
Yeah, the kind of technical plans that you had.
Yeah, the ones that are drawn?
Yeah, for me those were the ones that were kind of most suggestive of a built form, but it seemed like the notational system had as much emphasis as the actual cut through the walls. And for me that was interesting. I feel like the notational system gives them a lot of their spatial energy. So I'm wondering, in the reading of a plan as a construction document, would you be interested in like the intentional reading of those notational systems as spatial elements?
Yes, I would. So I'm trying to think about an architecture that simultaneously has indexical, notational, and physical properties that change over and through time. So the answer to the question is absolutely yes. In the back, please. Yeah.
Could you speak a little bit more on your thoughts behind the floor triptychs? And you were talking about how it relates to the ceiling, but then how they relate to each other also.
Yeah. So I'm arguably perspective. 1 point perspective, let's say, was developed 600 years ago, and it's essentially the dominant mode of representation, but also spatial articulation for 600 years. That's not so hard to argue. And it's not so hard to argue that perspective links through things like conical and spherical perspective, accelerated and decelerated perspective, anamorphosis, on and on and on through virtual realities and blah, blah, blah. So the thought with the floor triptych is to try to work a set of relationships which are not linked to subject, horizon, picture plane, vision. And the floor triptych is just helpful because the triptych can hold quite a lot in play. But to take it into the Jackson Pollock realm, the floor realm, we're painting, for me that was pivotal to when I first came to New York and to Columbia, and I didn't know anything about art, I still don't. But when I first saw Jackson Pollock and realized, wow, this is radical stuff, that somehow lasted with me, and it's just a few thoughts coming together now to try to challenge subject-object relationships, perspective, foreground, middle ground, distant ground, and try to discuss something that might have to do with that kind of contour. So it's early days. It interests me a lot, and I've been thinking about Michael's still life, yeah, where they're trying to work with historical evidence and put sort of new stuff into it. So knowing Michael a little bit, and so there are a number of connections that got me thinking about the floor triptych and how it was meant to be a key part of the Bartlett exhibition, but I just couldn't work out the discussions and how I might make it a physical thing. It was meant to be about 9 feet long and pieces of marble and milled pieces and cast brass pieces and so on. I'll get there, maybe. Yeah, please.
Two questions.
Sure.
There was a project in the beginning where you were talking about a room that you were designing, and it was dealing with heaven and hell, and it had kind of social and cultural context to it. My question about that is, you mentioned blue-collar workers. I'm just interested in what that means in relation to your project.
I should have said blue-collar neighborhood. So sorry, I didn't let you finish the question. I don't mean that in a demeaning way. It was a kind of a working class neighborhood where we lived. A better way to say it.
And then my second question
Was that a question?
Oh, yeah. So I was just wondering what does blue collar neighborhood or workers? Not. I mean, yeah.
Yeah,
Thank
I
you
get.
for clarifying that as well. But I guess it's
Mhm.
also an actual question of like,
Mhm.
what does that mean in relation to the project and how it
Mhm.
influences
Mhm.
your way of thinking in terms
Mhm.
of that
Mhm.
design thinking. And then the
Mhm.
second question is about the bird motel, and you mentioned the inverting of the bird and the human relationship. And how I interpret that was thinking about spatial relationships for the bird and how the humans are perceiving that or becoming the spectators revolving around that, instead of like the way we look at everything around us as the human
Mhm.
and animals and
Mhm.
everything is revolving around us. So it's like switching the position.
That's part of the idea. I think that there are a number of discussions in the last 8-10 years which have to do with particularly in the last 8 or 10 years, certainly before, that have to do with non-human relationships and how, for me, starting to think about, again, it's a perspective, the scene, the I, the station point, EYE, that there would be other kinds of ways to think about, as an architect, certainly design strategies and spatial makeup and so on that are not subject oriented, let's say, or human centric. So that's a much larger. I've spent no time really with that thinking, but that interests me. Things like object oriented ontology and actor network theory, and the things that are in the air that are other things that tickle. Some things about maybe we shouldn't be the dominant species, and the authorities, ruining the earth and so on. Ecological and environmental discussions. So the bird motels are a very, very meager, attempt to try to open some questions for me in that regard. And then I was going to try to get back to the sort of working class realm and the cemetery thematically constitute quite different worlds. So I was interested in the interior of the house, somehow being able to discuss things to do with paradigmatic cycles and life and death and blah, 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 and also the tellies that are on in the living rooms that sort of every house you go by, and sort of people riding bikes, that is everyday practices, how the interior of the house might start to discuss those things, but also sectionally then how the sort of deep symbolic and iconographic structure of the earth and things like the heavens might start to speak a little bit about that, sort of sectionally. So the way the upper spaces are arranged, the rubber basement, and the way they intersect with a double aquarium and a leather floor and cactus and sort of things that burn and inscribe things in steel walls and so on. There's an upside down object, St. Paul's Cathedral in London, in the double aquarium. There are a number of things that try to start to triangulate that the house is not primarily an interior. It is, but it's also trying to figure out how to discuss things outside of itself. Again, a super quick piece of work that would require, if I spent 75 hours in the house, it's probably to get it to really work, it's probably 600 or 800 or 1,000 hours to work on it properly. I'd need to change a lot, not just detailing stuff. Yeah, Octavia, please.
Can you explain how and why you started doing work like this? I mean, it's obvious, like I don't mean this like, if anything, it's like the major compliment. Like, I understand everything you said, but yet I get nothing at all.
That's
in
fair
terms
enough.
of your work. No, like
It's fairly
like
fair.
I understood like
get
the
that.
words, but
No,
I'm
I
saying
totally
like
get that. I
it's,
totally get that. I'll make a confession. To me, the work is totally normal work. It's totally normal work. The question in the back about notation and indexical, morphological, spatial conditions that are moving through different centuries and time frames and collapsing temporalities and so on. That's maybe a slightly different story, but this is figure ground work essentially. But to try to
I mean, yeah, like
try
I guess
to
that's the
draw your
pinpoint,
question, yeah, to try to.
Like, when did this start for you?
So for me, it has a lot to do with the naming problem that I call the naming problem. So in architectural education, things like typology and program and context have very, for me, pretty inscribed, deeply inherited worlds that come with them. And I just, probably being at SciArc where I think stuff got rattled around a little bit when I was there, and it's still the case. It occurred to me that maybe those things shouldn't be as sanctified as they were. So that's the naming problem's part of it. Then I began to understand a little bit that things were things, but they also structured relationships. So I remember seeing a trash can, and for me it was a trash can, it was an object. And I remember going away and taking a ride, and first there was the stuff in the trash can. It was at SciArc. I sort of got interested in it. I was riding in the Mulholland Drive, and it occurred to me that there was quite a lot going on in that trash can, from the labor forces that participated with it, the geographies from which things came, the kind of obsolescence of things, and blah 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 blah. So it occurred to me that there was quite a lot in that trash can, and it wasn't a thing any longer. It was a set of structured relationships that were temporally active and so on. So moving from naming to structuring was a big part of whatever I do. So I'll give you a simple example. If I ask you, and Gary and Andrew know this, Jimmy probably, and Michael, if I ask you to design a house, in all likelihood, people are going to work, you're doing something interesting, but there'll probably be things like bedrooms and bathrooms and maybe kitchens and maybe a garage and a yard or garden or something. Interesting. But if I ask you to think about, you have a beautiful daughter. I assume that you belong to Jimmy and. No, that's what I meant to say. I'm totally politically incorrect tonight. I got it totally. I'm in the tub. But if I ask you, Octavia, or others in the room, if I ask you to design conditions for hygiene and defecation, the privatization of sexuality, conditions of illness and psychotraumas, you might not design bedrooms where there's a bathroom probably nearby where you can kind of get easily to the kitchen and so on. You might rethink the typological condition of a house and open it up in terms of what kinds of things might be structured, not what kinds of things are named and assumed to be the default conditions. So it's simply moving from naming to structuring was a big thing for me. And then opening up the drawing in David's Island, that the drawing didn't have to be simply a description of things that I knew, but the drawing could do quite a lot of work. It could hold things in play that were hunches, things that I'd forgotten about, things that other people thought about. There could be very varied languages used in the drawing. So all drawing types, all conventional drawing types are relatively consistent, I would say. Line work, and whether dotted lines or center lines or profile lines or whatever. So it just occurred to me. I mean, there were a lot of people doing this stuff, but it was, for me, it was a bit of an awakening that I could write stuff in a drawing. I could cut paper out and have figures. I could make notational marks, and they could coexist. And that eventually, the hope was that they would discuss one another, and I could work out what was being discussed, and that there were latent and tacit knowledges being constructed by holding quite a few fragments of things in play that in the construction of the drawing that I was learning things. So the drawing's really, really critical for me. But I feel really hamstrung now because I don't have digital skills. And it's really, really hard. Again, I think about all kinds of things which are morphologically active. Material states are changing, things are rescaling in non-scalar relationships, and things are stable, and things are there for 10 seconds and gone forever and come back in a memory construction. Those are really, really difficult for me to draw. I can image things, but it's really, really hard to work on things the way that I work. So I really feel hamstrung. I feel like I don't have any skills to work on a lot of things that I want to work on. Yes, please.
Some questions like.
Sorry, I don't hear so well.
Questions like Octavia, can you talk about your analog drawing in detail, like what is the thought process when you were making the drawing, and what is the actual process, and what comes into your mind, and like why you're drawing the way it is, and what do the line or cutout means to you?
Whoa. Where's the sofa? And people I've worked with a bit, they know it's one of the design methods. I identified 14, and there are probably 114 design methods, and we use them in combinations and so on. Analogic thinking for me is really, really helpful because I have really limited skills and understandings about what to do with ideas. But when I work and think analogically, I can connect to things which have similar relational properties that allow me to concretize certain aspects of what I'm working on. So if I might have a set of ideas and I think, well, if that was organized like a traveling freak show, or the relational properties of a traveling freak show are not dissimilar from some things I'm trying to think about, when I can lock into the traveling freak show, things become more concrete to me because the traveling freak show is something which is known, and I'm trying to discover what can be known. So analogic thinking allows me to connect to things well outside of my own skill sets. A. B, analogic thinking can increase your formal and material range. This isn't to do with your question. As I said in one of the 24 I likes, 100-fold. So that the top of the building could be like I'm just going to make it up, it could be like the crown of the Queen of England crossed with a rave and tattooed like a rattlesnake. And by making those analogic connections, for me, I'm interested in increasing my formal and material range, so that I have more ability to contact the ideas that I have in mind. I need to have range with the deliverables to contact the ideas that I don't have a clue what the deliverables will be. So analogic thinking is helpful in that regard. To answer your question a little more specifically then, it depends what I'm working on. Normally when I work and I'm using analogic thinking, I normally have a set of ideas in play. So I talk about smart analogs. You don't have to have any ideas in play, like crowns of Queens of England and whatever stupid stuff I said, a rave crossed with rattlesnake skin. So analogic thinking, it doesn't rely on having a bunch of ideas. When I work with it, amongst other methods that I work with, normally I have an idea or a set of ideas that I can't yet concretize, either conceptually, philosophically, materially. So I try to make analogic connections if that's appropriate. And then you asked about how you make them. Depends what I'm working on. So if it's an analogic conceptual structure, that's different than if it's an analogical formal or material condition that I'm trying to register. So it depends. And I don't always use analogic thinking. I use all kinds of design methods, sometimes knowingly, sometimes unknowingly. We all do. We all work in particular ways. I'm just trying to It mostly comes through teaching. My interest in design methods becoming slightly more frontal because they do things, they don't do certain things. We interface with them authorially in different ways. They have different relationships to spatial makeup or not. Some shuttle ideas, some are direct. I just think it's really, really important. I think it's architecture 101. Design methods and representational techniques are fundamental in relationship to the history of ideas. Those are absolutely fundamental things. So I think they're really important. And I like the sonic. Yes, please.
So in relation to Octavia's question and somewhat Sarah thoughts, can you speak more on like sort of your narratives in some of your projects in terms of the relation of like the naming problem or typology and how your creation of narrative and I think the desert housing project, how that collides, or the birdhouse, how that collides with the naming problem or typology in any way?
This is a super good question. So I've gotten a little more, sometimes when you talk about narratives and allegories and metaphors, you can sound like an old fogey. Like this is stuff of a distant past. But increasingly with social media, the distribution of knowledge and so forth, I'm starting to think a little bit more about narrative constructions as a form of, you're more than welcome. I'm starting to think a little bit recently about narrative constructions or what we might mean in terms of shared. We're not going back to a symbolic realm where symbols and the Renaissance and the Baroque start to get a little bit fuzzy, but we're not going to go back there. So I'm just trying to think about storytellings of certain kinds that might increase the audience rate. But the desert house, for example, the one with the chrome shadows, that's not that one did not emanate from anything like a narrative. It emanated from a series of interests to do with ground, sky, and horizon, things to do with archetypal conditions in the desert, things to do with optical structure in the desert. There was no story. I tell it like there's a story. There's no story in that. The bird motels are slightly different.
Yeah. It was just more so like you mentioned the chrome 8-ball, the log house that would eventually show the log house, and you described how someone would move and weave through the houses, and you gave these houses names and function.
Yeah, you're asking a really interesting question because I'm oscillating between an interest in indeterminacy, contingency, kind of critical fragments, and you make their plausibilities, which you can construct your own possibilities out of those plausibilities. So that's quite a lot different than narrative constructions, which...
Yeah. So there's like more of a leaning towards like a viscerality rather than...
In narratives?
Yeah.
No, narratives, I mean, think about mythologies. I mean, they may be visceral to you, but they're not things. They're normally not things, but they have cultural construction. They have cultural handles that allow us to participate with them. So I just think a lot about things like mythologies and folklore, and I think a little bit about those things, and just shared with the number of Instagram. You know, someone said, you know, Cyrus Pennyroyal. Cyrus said something like, there's a guy who teaches in Michigan, super interesting guy. Jimmy knows him, Cyrus Pennyroyal. You may know the facts. There's something like 4 million images uploaded like every 10 seconds in the world. So there's quite a lot of stuff. And I'm just trying to work. I mean, it's an outrageous amount of material. And so the narratives and allegories and myths and so forth just have to do with maybe trying to rethink a collective, some form of collective. It's, we do the theaters, libraries, and so forth. They're not the things which orient us culturally. But those institutions, those things, they may in New York. Generally, no. So the narratives that come out of a small interest in shared communication about subjects, maybe the politics of communication, things that might matter culturally. These are really, really good questions. Now we gotta. Yes, sir. Gary? Then I'll come. Yeah, go ahead.
I noticed that Carl put in some rubber duckies into one of your bird motels.
Yes.
That's a different kind of bird, but do you think there's a potential to have purple cattle
Yes.
plural,
So
into your other version?
yes, I do. So Gary, you need a little bit of touch. This could feel like a total non sequitur to all of you, as if the work didn't already. Oh, damn it. So Gary, I had the pleasure of working with Gary last year at the University of Michigan. He works for Professor Stern now. He was in the thesis cohort, and he did a really an amazing piece of work to do with rerouting and rethinking Parc La Villette via Koolhaas. And he manufactured a whole through sort of, what are they, kind of iconic objects, things which are familiar to us, watches and cameras and so on. Anyway, as part of the work, I have no idea how many. The thesis unit was called Double Purple. They're always colors. So we've got, I don't know how many cattle, how many cows are in that thing? Double purple cows.
Over 100 smaller ones and like a gold and silver one as well.
Yeah. So the other guy that helped on the bird motel worked on some rubber ducks that were a bit, they were like buoys, but they were sort of Trojan horse-like things. Anyway, so a couple of those things turned up in the bird motel, and Gary's just wondering if there's room for purple cattle. And the answer to that question is absolutely. They're going to be doing work on the log, man. Oxen. Yeah, they're going to be grading, trimming, pruning, seeding, fertilizing the log. That all right?
Yeah.
You'll send us digital models?
I'll send you plenty.
Okay. The pleasures of having people that you know in the audience. Yeah, that's a good question, Gary. There was one. Yeah, please.
So you were talking about analogic thinking, but you also mentioned the concept of appropriational thinking. So how would you differentiate the two? Because they're pretty similar in a lot of ways. Because when you think of appropriation, it's taken from an idea for making it your own.
Yes.
And in addition to that, you talk about analogy, which is taking something similar to the idea you have.
Yep.
And then that's already in existence, and then because it's similar to the idea you have, it's using that to mediate what you're doing. So how would you differentiate the two?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Those two methods both start with A, so that's a shared constitution. I would talk about those as cousins.
Yeah.
But with appropriation, for me, when you appropriate something, you use it normally in a directish way. When you're working analogically or thinking analogically, you're only in the world of likenesses. So there's a translational problem that comes with analogic thinking. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
This is like this behaves like this references things, that conceptual structure references things like that. You're only in a realm of likeness. You're only in a proximal relationship. You're not appropriation, you got it. It is yours. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So analogic thinking is always it's what I call a shuttle method. It's a method which allows you to shuttle between ideas and things or phenomena, but there's still a translational question in there. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So if the house is organized like the game of Go, it is not the game of Go. It is not that. It is organized like that. And then when you're working analogically or thinking that way, it's important to think about, well, which aspects of the game of Go is it like? Because analogic thinking, you can take fragments of things, phenomena, conceptual structures, not the whole thing. So I'm interested in the way the Odyssey is structured, but I'm not interested in the linguistic that go on in it. So sometimes I pick and choose partial conditions and analogs. That's normal. You can do that with appropriation, but with appropriation, you're in the game directly. The extreme version of that, of course, is plagiarism, which is a legitimate way to work. It's not something we condone, but it's a totally legitimate way to work. Sherry Levine, who makes lots of money with her work, she's plagiarized Brancusi, others, I mean, straight up. So I'm not, when we talk about design methods, I'm not really trying to locate them in terms of this exposure. Ethically, Just trying to say these are ways that you can work. So plagiarism's on the other side of you get chucked out of school, right? Or run out of the country. But it is still a legitimate way to produce work. Architecture gets in trouble. Lawsuits, lots of lawsuits recently. People copying this, apparently copying that, and so on. But it's still a legitimate way to work. Are there other questions out there? Yes, please.
I had a question about how you situate your viewer exactly, because
How I situate
your viewer, like
the viewer.
yeah, because there's such a fluency that you've established in both. Like you have this fluency in a language that's both spoken and drawn, and
That's
like,
super generous of you. I
get it.
wouldn't have thought of myself.
It's like you're like a lot of things that you say and that you're drawing. I recognize, and there's like a resonance from within the architectural discipline, but it's like obviously like feels other still. And so I'm wondering, like when I see like your work that's of the, what was it called, and like there's a name for everything else. There's like you're against naming, but then you like make a new name for it, and I like hear it, and I'm like, yeah, I know what that means, and I think about it, and I'm like, no, I don't know what that means. But in terms of the drawings where you're connecting different ideas, like am I meant to get it, or is it for you? Like,
Yeah, this is a really nice question. It's not uncommon to get this kind of question when I share work, and I'm sure with other people as well. I don't mean this in a demeaning way. I got really lucky to have someone see a few drawings of mine some years ago and then asked me to exhibit some things, and I've been incredibly honored and humbled to be able to be a part of a fair number of solo and group exhibitions on the one hand. On the other hand, it's really, really difficult for me because it's simply the way that I work. And I'm quite honestly, this is the part that I don't mean in a demeaning way. I'm trying to make, in the early work, I'm trying to make drawings that ultimately structure the things in spatial makeup that I think might be relevant or appropriate or even necessary to work on. The ways in which I work on them, and so I care about that at a cultural level, the ways in which I work on them, I couldn't give a toss if people understand things that are there. And I don't mean that in a demeaning way. Those are worksheets for me. That's what I mean by getting the opportunity to exhibit. I mean, that's literally I'm not making those to put out in the world. That's just the way I work on stuff. So, but what I've come to understand is often there are enough marks where people can participate in some way or ways in them. They'll see something like a grid, and they begin to see this map-like. Or they'll see characters and they begin to think about, well, this might be a stage set that's staging some sort of characters. So or paint chips where they say, wow, we painted our daughter's bedroom and we looked at some paint chips. So the hope is that maybe I'm working on stuff, but that they might have other ways in. But Octavia's observation and question is a really, really good one. And to me, it seems like really banal, it seems like really, really straightforward work to me. And I don't mean that facetiously or, it doesn't look like work necessarily that I'm going to go out and, when I'm walking across the Bowery, I might not see some of that work, but it's not, I don't think it's unusual work. It might be slightly more unusual if I worked on something and developed something properly. There's not a single piece of work that's even half-cocked. To be perfectly honest, I know better. I've been around these kind of places, people, institutions. I know better than what the stuff is. And I mean that wholeheartedly. I mean, I've been at 75 schools, I've been around characters, places like this. I've been super, super fortunate, so I should be better than I am. Seriously. I mean, some of the best minds, some of the best work, some of the best institutions, the best people, the best resources. I've been super, super, super fortunate, and I simply should know better. And I don't mean that in a self-deprecating way. I don't mean it that way at all. I just know what good work can be, and I haven't done it.
How come those idea drawings are?
Say it again.
How come the idea drawings, I don't know what you call them, how come you can't consider those good work? Like
I mean, the thinking there might be some thinking that's decent, but they haven't found the maturity in spatial representational makeup. It's really I come back always to Wallace Stevens' 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. You're talking about a blackbird, but you're talking about it from 13 radically different positions, and to make good work in my world, you need to understand those 13 positions, and they're really, really different. I might understand 2.5 of them at best in one of those pieces of work, to be perfectly honest with you. And to make work that has cultural durability, that might contribute to someone's life, or they're thinking about it, it deserves 13 ways of looking at it. And then to work the relational properties to the degree that you're actually structuring things that you say you're doing, or want to try to do. Yes, please.
At what point in your design or drawing process does color come in and its specificity? And do you think it's linked to narrative in any way?
I mean, it could be linked to narrative. No, it's not. It's not directly related to that. Color comes in it when I work half properly. I'm trying to work on the things that matter in that phase of the work, and I'm trying to tailor the ways in which I work on those things. So it depends. The answer to the question about colors, it really depends what I'm working on, when I'm working on it, and how it matters relative to the other things that I'm trying to work on. So there's not a wholesale answer or ubiquitous answer to that question. It's not like I always do it or never do it. It's just
Is there a drawing that color was the first kind of question?
some of those Photoshop, the first things that I cycled through, some of those probably the color and the figural properties of color and figuration. Some of that was probably early, but colors normally not early. It's not normally. I work on a kind of content to form method, a meta method, where I have ideas, and then I try to, like everybody, probably try to collaborate ideas with methods and try to work out how to produce form from the content. So normally I begin with ideas. The Photoshop, this 140 Photoshop, I don't have a single idea. Just that I'm trying to work out. I literally don't know how to work the, Gary knows this, Andrew knew it when he was in school, Jimmy, Michael. Photoshop, I literally could open it, but I couldn't, there wasn't a thing that I could do in it. So I said, the magic wand, I did a tutorial, and so I'm literally just trying to work out how to cut something out of an image that I can put somewhere else. So I'm not thinking about stuff too much, I'm just trying to work out. That seems like a pretty interesting pattern, and if I, played a kind of an exquisite corpse game with things that I began to bring into the Photoshop realm, could I rethink domestic practices, gardens, and landscapes? So those have no thinking. I mean, I think about them, but I'm making them at 1 a.m. in the morning after I finish teaching, or whatever, and just work on them for an hour. And I started those about 1.5 years ago. So, but they're getting more interesting now to me, what they could become. Anybody else have a question? I'm happy to. Is it still Friday?
I just want to say it's so great to have you, Barry.
Say it again.
It's wonderful. It's wonderful.
Thanks,
to hear
Michael.
you
Yeah.
talk. Wonderful, always.
Yeah.
It's like somehow I describe it as two sort of parallel worlds constructing each other simultaneously. The drawings are doing one thing, and then the way that you are able to verbally articulate them are doing something in parallel. And I always wondered if you do it the same way twice. And you don't have to answer it. You can hold this for yourself and
I will do that.
whichever way.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's important for those of you who may have seen your work. I think it's also a crucial thing to have you here and hear the ways in which you think about it, talk about it, and articulate. I would say it's not necessarily explaining the meaning of it. It's building a kind of parallel track of investigations simultaneously together. And I think that's one of the things that gives it an extraordinary richness.
Thank you very much. I really, I super appreciate that. And yeah, these characters and some of the characters in the back I've known for a little while. I don't know them well, but to hear that, I mean, it's really meaningful to me for you to say that. But the other thing is, it's really hard for me to talk. I don't think of myself as smart at all, and I don't think that I articulate things. So it's really hard for me to do things like lectures. I just don't think the way I work on things and think about things is much more interesting to me than I'm able to share. So it feels like I go back to the hotel tonight with my head hung, and then, oh gosh, that was miserable. They were totally bored. Why am I doing this? And the next time someone asks me, I'm just going to say no thanks. But I'm really humbled, super honored.
Have you
Yeah,
guys
it's really.
carried through the studio? How long have you been here? Were you
So I came about, Natalie, Brandy, Jeremy, and Javier were super generous. It's amazing here. I was saying that in the middle of New York City, or no, not the middle, but in New York City, to have the stuff you have here, it's absolutely phenomenal. Yeah, so I've seen a little bit of it.
I wanted you to see it, and I wanted the students to be able to have a conversation.
I asked one of them, I said, is there an empty desk here? I'm in. But I'd have to bring my iMac. I'd have to bring my iMac as well and work on a little bit on Photoshop. Any other? Yeah, thank you very much, Michael. It's total pleasure. I can't tell you. It's totally great to be here. And I'm not saying that just to say that. Kulper it's a super special place. Pay attention. You're constructing the place. I'm telling you. It's amongst the 3 or 4 most important schools in the history of architectural education. Without doubt. Without a doubt.
Any other questions? I also say just one last comment. I think it's great that you're here. I think when I first got here, to come out here somehow. We tried to do it for a couple of years and it didn't work out. So, and Octavia became Octavia's mission a couple of years ago, and I was like, go for it. And so I'm really happy that you're here. So a few guys that I turn up in the studio, I'll say stuff like, if you work for 20 hours in one day, you do that for 2 days, that's a work week. Right? This is the person I got that from.
So this is a little bit of, sorry, this is still Friday, so I'll be quick. So when Jimmy was when he was at SciArc, I used to go, when we pitched vertical studios, I don't know whether I said it when he was in the pool, I said, if you can't spend 50 hours a week in the studio, don't bother. Because I think it's really hard. I think by some, I don't mean this in a demeaning way to other disciplines. I think by miles, architecture is the most interesting discipline in the world. Right? You can, in a sentence, right, you can talk about philosophy, a film you saw last week, what you had for lunch, and some drawing that you speculated about a month ago in the same sentence. And if you think about the history of ideas, optics, geometry, mathematics, philosophy, religion. Architecture, it's discussed through and by those things, and it's discussing those things. It's incredible. I think it's really hard. Therefore, I think we have a responsibility to humanity, to the generosity of enabling people to live the fullest lives possible. We have a gift of participating in a discipline which I think touches all disciplines. The trouble is, I couldn't live 6 lifetimes and begin to scratch the surface of the complexities of spatial makeup. Sometimes I do this. I'll hold a Ticonderoga pencil up with the students and I'll say, what kinds of things make the pencil possible? They'll sort of look at me quizzically. What's that guy talking about? He gets paid to teach them, what the hell? And then I'll ask them, I'll say, deforestation, mass production, the history of writing. Then I'll point to the eraser and say censorship. And they say, Now those things aren't frontal. Those aren't frontal in the world of the pencil, but they belong in the network of relationships, to be simple about it. They somehow belong to the world of the pencil. If that's the pencil, we're not even talking yet about the body holding the pencil and the body in space and so on. Our spatial realms are phenomenally rich. Yeah, it's an incredible discipline. We're so lucky to be a part of it.
Also, is there a better word than Ticonderoga? That's a great word. There's a Tom Waits song with Ticonderoga in it. The battle with the British lost in Lake Champlain trying to take Ticonderoga.
Yeah.
What a great word.
Yeah. This is one of the many things that I like about my friend Michael Young. Anybody else? Had enough? Thank you all very much.